My passion had always been the issue of psychiatric assault, forced interventions, and how to bring human rights to bear on that issue. When I was in law school, I participated in the International Women's Human Rights Clinic, where I got specific training that helped me to figure out how to make arguments in a human rights framework that would really advance the rights of people who hadn't been included in human rights before, because that's what the women's human rights advocates had worked on. And so throughout that process, I was thinking, oh, we're talking about how to argue that we're talking about rape as torture. We're talking about sexual slavery as a kind of slavery. Well, how does this apply to psychiatric interventions? So I started thinking about it then. At the same time, I was also learning about the Americans with Disabilities Act and learning how the framework of disability anti-discrimination laws opened up a whole world, allowed people to highlight discrimination against people with disabilities as a social group instead of seeing disability as a negative thing about a person or as a difficult individual challenge. So the politicizing of disability made me understand how users and survivors of psychiatry needed something like that for ourselves, how we could politicize our identity and the discrimination against us in a legal framework. We are included in the definition of people with disabilities, but often disability laws have not really included us. They haven't been effective to change the conditions that have been our biggest social challenges, such as the issue of forced interventions and being deprived of legal capacity. They went more towards changing the physical structures in ways that make the world more accessible to people with physical disabilities, and the concept of accessibility and reasonable accommodation have been helpful for us, but in a more tangential way. Soon after I graduated from law school, I learned that the United Nations was going to start work on a new convention, a human rights treaty on the rights of people with disabilities. There are three main issues that are contentious and that are central for us. One is the issue of legal capacity. For us, it's said that if you're mad or someone thinks you're mad, then you don't really have the capacity to make decisions about your own life. And that is it's very circular, because then if you're mad, then it's said that you need treatment and you don't have the capacity to decide whether or not you should have treatment. So it feeds into forced interventions, commitment to a psychiatric institution, the whole paternalistic setup that says you're a danger to yourself, you're a danger to other people. We have to do this to you for your own good. So we're coming from the perspective that says, no, we're all human beings, we're all equal as human beings. Some of us may need a little more support at times. All of us need a little support at times. And the fact that we may need support isn't a reason to take away our right to have the final say in our own lives. And that's required by the ultimate principles of dignity and respect for any human being as a human being. If you take away my right to decide the fundamental questions of what I want to do with my life, and whether, and what I want to do with my own mind, whether I want to see myself as someone with a mental disease or whether I would rather see it as something that is part of my own growth and evolution as a human being. If you're taking away my right to have my own final say in all that, it's like saying that I'm not really a person. It's saying that I have to be under somebody else. I'm not really equal. There's somebody else who's going to be on top of me. And every person needs to have their own dignity, their own human rights, and the right to exercise your human rights, the right to assert your human rights, because without legal capacity, you can say that I have, the right to informed consent or the right to live where I choose. But if I don't have legal capacity, then those rights mean nothing, because it's always somebody else who has to exercise those rights on my behalf. So it means that I'm really a petitioner all the time. I'm not really a person who's making my own decisions and doing these things for myself. On legal capacity also, there's a great deal of interest in the move towards a supported decision-making model that recognizes everyone has the right to legal capacity and everyone has the right to use support in decision-making if they want, but you don't do things to people against their will. So there's a lot of interest in that, and we feel that there's a chance to work with governments, especially on that article, to figure out how they can actually move from their present system, which entails guardianship, to a system that's about providing support in decision-making without taking away people's rights. Okay, so the next one is that we want to make sure that there's no deprivation of liberty based on disability. That's the formulation that we've developed to make it clear that putting us in a mental institution or that having any kind of separate system of detention that's only applicable if you have a mental illness is discrimination and is unacceptable in human rights terms, because in the human rights system, it's understood that governments will sometimes deprive people of liberty. If a person committed a crime, if a person is arrested, sometimes for immigration reasons, governments detain people. And in human rights law, there have not been very many limitations on governments' right to deprive people of liberty for particular reasons. But there is also a general principle of non-discrimination that all of the human rights should be applied without discrimination. And disability has already been understood as a category of prohibited discrimination, and this convention will make that explicit. So we wanted to say no deprivation of liberty based on disability to tie it into this concept of non-discrimination. If the convention will prohibit deprivation of liberty based on disability, it will mean that all of the mental health laws saying that you can lock someone up for either a long or short term because they're mentally ill and a danger to themselves or others, or because they're mentally ill and in need of care and treatment, those laws will have to be abolished. That will be a huge freedom for people with disabilities. That will be a huge freedom for users and survivors of psychiatry. And to me, it helps me to just imagine, to see the text of the convention saying, deprivation of liberty shall in no case be based on disability, and imagine yourself free. Imagine if that came into force and we did not have to fear being locked up because we might start to act crazy, or we might do something unusual somebody is going to label as crazy. I don't know, for me that's a very profound thing, because to be deprived of your liberty is the first step in deprivation of other rights. When you are admitted involuntarily to a mental institution, it's like a ceremony of degradation, a ceremony of depersonalization. You know, you might have your clothes taken away from you, all your possessions taken away from you, and it's essentially a ceremony that's telling you that you're no longer a separate person with your own unique identity, your own unique destiny. Now you have become an inmate of this institution, and you are to do as you're told. And that is what we want to eliminate with this convention, to say that that can never happen. Whatever the reasons that might be given to say, well, you might need to be in a safe place. If I need to be in a safe place, I should be able to agree that I want to be in a safe place and that I want you to help me keep myself safe, and to not have the door locked and somebody else decides whether I need to be kept safe for my own good. And if it's not a situation where I feel I need to be kept safe, if it's a situation where somebody else feels that maybe I'm going to harm someone else, then that should be dealt with through law enforcement and criminal justice system equally with other people. If you think that I might go and kill a boyfriend or a girlfriend or a sister or whoever, and that person should be able to go and get an order of protection against me. Don't say that because I am labeled with mental illness, then that person's fear of me should justify putting me in detention, putting me into a separate system. And so it needs to focus on the actual potential of victimization and not on whether the person can be labeled with a disability. Okay, so the next one is about forced interventions. And the language that we've developed for that issue has been that we want to prohibit forced interventions aimed at correcting, improving, or alleviating any actual or perceived impairment. And that language was difficult. It was difficult to develop the right language, but I felt that was a good choice because it makes the connection that we have a right to be who we are. If we have an impairment, something that other people consider an impairment about us, an impairment is a kind of technical disability language. Users and survivors of psychiatry often would not identify with that word, but madness can be understood as at least somebody else is perceiving that we have an impairment. And so if somebody is perceiving that there's something wrong with us, we still have a right to be who we are. And if other people want to change our minds and bodies against our will, that's a profound violation of our being, of our mind and body and spirit. And speak for myself, that was the most profound thing that, in a sense, drove me mad. I believe, and I've made the argument, based on the international definition of torture, based on all the elements of that definition, that these forced interventions actually do constitute torture. And it's an intentional act that's inflicting severe mental or physical pain or suffering on a person. And it's done for purposes such as coercion, intimidation, can be interrogation or confession, punishment, or for purpose, for any reason related to discrimination of any kind. Clearly, it's discrimination because the whole purpose is to change you from the state that you're in to something else that they would prefer you to be. They're not really changing you to a better state that's anything objectively better. They don't really even claim that they're changing you from a mad person to a normal person. They're really changing you from a mad person who's experiencing madness naturally, or someone who's just experiencing themselves and other people think you're mad, into a person who's drugged and who walks around in a drugged state. And that many people even consider being like a zombie or feeling like a zombie. A state where you don't really have as much control or awareness over what you're doing, and you don't really have the freedom in your own mind to have your own thoughts and emotions develop naturally. So because it's their awareness and judgment that the state you're in is not worth being in and that it should be changed, that's a kind of disability-based discrimination. So clearly it's has one of those purposes of torture. These forced interventions are also used for the purposes of coercion and intimidation. And it's as if the intervention itself is both coercion and intimidation, as well as the actual thing that they want you to keep doing because they want you to change you. So they use these interventions to coerce you into, in a sense, to coerce you into being somebody that you don't want to be, to living in a way that is an oppressed way of living, a subordinated way of living, to accept, yes, I am a mental patient and I need to take these drugs. And I think there's also a kind of coercion involved in, there's a coercion that's inherent in changing your mind through physical means, through the means of mind-altering drugs, because everything that we do, all of our actions start in our mind. You can't do anything without having the mental component, or you can do anything but it's only an involuntary reflex unless you have the mental component of your own actions. So the involuntary psychiatric interventions, because they work on your mind, it's a form of coercion, not necessarily to get you to do a particular thing or stop you from doing a particular thing, but to prevent you from actually having the ability to act on your own and do the things that you want to do. And it's also often used as a punishment. That's very common, that people are drugged because they asked for a smoke in the wrong way, or they asked to go to the bathroom at a time when the nurse was busy, and trivial things like that. It's used as a form of punishment and also intimidation to just establish that you're in a subordinate status and we can do this to you anytime we want to. And in a sense, you can also say that it's used to elicit information or a confession where the confession is a confession of mental illness. Now, it's clear that these interventions inflict severe mental and physical pain and suffering, and that they're done intentionally, that they're done they're done intentionally with the knowledge of the nature of what the intervention is, that it is a mind-altering drug or a mind-altering procedure, and that people experience these drugs as disorganizing their thoughts, as making their minds confused, as dampening down the ability to think and feel and react. There's also an aspect of this that's about informed consent, that if a person is discussing it with their own doctor and says, well, you know, maybe a small dose of this neuroleptic drug might help get rid of my voices and I'm willing to try that, and they agree to do it, then in that case it wouldn't be torture, because it would be for a different purpose, and it would not be the infliction of pain and suffering on the person. It would be the person's own choice to use this for their own well-being. And it's understood that there are certain kinds of healthcare choices that might entail some amount of discomfort, but it would not constitute torture if it's informed consent. But under circumstances where the person is not consenting, and where it's this, especially where it's the kind of intervention that will change your identity, that will change your personality, that will change everything about who you are as a human being and your ability to interact based on your own desires as a human being, that would have to be torture. And we also see that this interrelates with the issue of legal capacity, because it cannot be said that a person is giving informed consent unless the person, him or herself, actually has been given the information and makes the decision, yes, I'm going to do this. If the convention will articulate our rights in a way that will actually mean that forced interventions are prohibited, that psychiatric civil commitment is prohibited, then it will become binding on governments. Now, governments may sign and ratify a lot of treaties, and then they have to actually comply with them. It's not a given that once a government ratifies a treaty that they will actually comply with it. The advocates still have to do a lot of work